Welcome to Frasier on Film, the Frasier TV show podcast with a twist. Each episode of the podcast visits each episode of Frasier across its 11-series run. But our main focus isn't on the good doctor himself, no. It's going to be one of the guest appearances on the show that week. That could be one of the many A-listers who called into Frasier's KACL radio show, or just someone who made a fleeting appearance at Cafe Nervosa. We'll delve into that actor's backstory, look over their cinematic offerings, and deep dive into one movie specifically. By the end, we'll see if we can make a connection between their character in Frasier and their character in the film we've just talked about. So you'll be hearing about icons and wash-ups, legends and starlets, sherry drinkers and beer guzzlers, blockbusters and B-movies. It's going to be an education in it all. But what if you don't really watch Frasier? That's fine, you'll probably know the actors we're talking about. And if you don't really know the actors we're talking about, then that's fine too. You'll know the movies. So whether you're a fan of Frasier or you're a fan of film, this is the podcast for you. So, pull up your favourite bar stool at McGinty's and tell the wine club you'll be running late, because this is Frasier on Film, and I'm your host, Ben Murray, and you're listening. What if Frasier, on his quest for solitude, ended up in the actual Fortress of Solitude? Welcome back. Season 1, Episode 2 of Frasier on Film and of Frasier. Thanks for coming back, folks. Here we are, this time focusing on Space Quest, a continuation of the story really from episode 1. And we are focusing this episode on Christopher Reeve and his film exploit, Village of the Damned, which I have never seen. Obviously, the man is most famous for Superman, I know that. Sadly, I guess he became also infamous with his paralysis and his injury in later life. And while very sad, I'm looking forward to talking about it and exploring the journey, what his career was like before that happened and how his personal life was affected afterwards. I have to admit, I really don't know much other than his Superman exploits when it comes to Christopher Reeve. So this is going to be real education for me as we go along. Fantastic episode for you today, guys. Another hilarious one. Let's just get right into it, shall we?
Dad! I can't read my paper. Eddie's staring at me.
Well, you do make quite a picture in the morning. Just ignore him.
I'm trying to.
I'm talking to the dog.
Season 1, Episode 2, titled Space Quest, air date 23rd September 1993. Writers Cy Duquesne and Denise Moss. Director James Burrows. First thing to say is Kelsey Grammer / Frasier's hair continues to be absolutely horrific. It's just so puffy and blowing out the back. Thank God he did away with it after like 2 seasons. It's almost horrific as the sight Daphne sees as Frasier has his dressing gown wide open. 6 more weeks of winter, I see, she says. What we get in this episode is the real day-to-day conflict in store for Frasier. There's clashes over breakfast. Someone's already read his newspaper. Daphne's messed with his coffee. Martin has his pinny on and is making himself at home. Martin's not interested in anything Frasier's got to say. The whole thing is get used to it. At KACL, rattled by the morning's events, Frasier leads his show with the topic of intrusion. And our guest for this week, Christopher Reeve, calls in as Leonard, an agoraphobiac. More on that a little later. We get our first mention and visit of Bob Bulldog Briscoe, played expertly and excellently over the years by Dan Butler. Frasier overhears Roz talking openly about sex on the phone to her mum, causing him to reflect on his own relationship with his dad and the fact that they just don't have that level of openness. But he's not in too much of a rush to get home to his dad to look for that openness. What he's looking for is somewhere to read his book, some solitude alone. But when he goes home, that's disturbed. When he goes to Cafe Nervosa, that's disturbed by all the usual suspects. Daphne, for example, suggests pouring out some tea. Frasier says he's just poured out a glass of wine. And Jane leaves delivery of, I see. Perfect. Martin also has just had it. He's sick to the back of his teeth with Frasier's fussy complaints about things. At the coffee shop, Niles encourages Frasier to be patient and to try and actually engage and talk to their dad in order to form some mutual ground and bond for them to work on going forward. And when he gets home, Martin says he hopes that Frasier only wants to talk for 3 minutes because his program's coming on. So Frasier sets the timer for 3 minutes and they sit down to share something vulnerable. Frasier shares the time when he almost took his own life, when he crawled out on a ledge. Martin, meanwhile, shares how he discovered he can turn his eyelid inside out, like they do at camp. Naturally, bickering ensues until the 3-minute timer cuts them off. It's played for laughs, but it does end with a quite beautiful sentiment from Martin that the sort of growth Frasier is looking for takes 3 years, not 3 minutes. It's poignant, and it ends with Martin saying, "It will go by before you know it." And Frasier's response is either that or it will seem like an eternity. It's another amazingly heartfelt episode. The humour is so on point, but the emotional state of our characters is laid bare early on in the show. It's embedded throughout the whole run, which is why I love it so much. I can only imagine how the Cheers crowd felt about this new state of the game. Surely delighted. Frasier is superior in almost every way to Cheers by my own reckoning. The jokes are funnier, it's smarter, it's richer, it's got more heart. So I'm hoping that all those who went through the graduation process of Cheers were happy with what they got on the other end of it.
I heard that.
Well, of course you heard it. You're never out of earshot.
You've always been like this. You were always a fussy little kid, and it's gotten worse ever since. You and your precious morning routine. You gotta have your coffee. You gotta have your quiet. You gotta have this. You gotta have that. Well, aren't you the little hothouse orchid?
Hey.
So some trivia from this episode. Frasier makes a reference to his early suicide attempt. That was actually seen in the episode of Cheers entitled The Girl in the Plastic Bubble. When Frasier greets his brother at Cafe Nervosa, he turns from his book and says, "What fresh hell is this?" which is how writer Dorothy Parker used to answer her telephone, apparently. It's also one of the most popular phrases used by one of my favourite people on Twitter. In Bulldog's first appearance, he barges in to use Frasier's radio broadcast booth, saying the studio he broadcast from, Studio C, lost the transmitter link power. But in future episodes, he's always broadcasting from Frasier's booth without explanation. And despite his juvenile character, Bulldog, Dan Butler, was actually the oldest member of the cast, other than John Mahoney. But let's return to our focus for the episode. Christopher Reeve, or as we know him, Leonard.
Hello, Leonard. I'm listening.
Oh, hi, Dr. Crane. I'm a little nervous, but, well, here goes. Several years ago, I became afraid of large open spaces. Like, if I went to the mall, I'd break out in a cold sweat. I'd get so scared that I'd have to run home.
Yes, Leonard, and your comments on intrusion?
Nothing. It's just that now I'm afraid to go outside at all. I haven't seen another person in 8 months.
Well, Leonard, it sounds like you may have a very serious condition known as agoraphobia. But you're not alone.
But I am alone, Dr. Crane.
So Christopher Reeve, born on September 25th, just a day before previous guest Linda Hamilton, in 1952. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old, and he moved with his mother from New York to New Jersey. As a teen, he excelled academically, athletically, and on stage. And Reeve has said the reason he believes he was so good at such a young age was because of the difficult relationship he had with his father, a man whose love for his children seemed tied to how well they performed. From age 9, Reeve began acting in school plays, and upon joining Cornell University, he immediately signed up for the theatre department. He'd made a promise to his mother and stepfather not to leap into an acting career until he'd completed his studies. A promise which was made difficult when he was approached by a man named Stark Hesseltine, a high-powered agent for actors such as Robert Redford and Michael Douglas. Hesseltine was impressed and wanted to represent him, but as a compromise, Reeve agreed to visit him in New York once a month to meet casting agents and producers, allowing him the time he needed to complete his college education. Before his third year of college, Reeve took a 3-month leave of absence and travelled around the UK, taking inspiration from the stars on stage in Glasgow and at the Old Vic in London. When he returned to New York, he joined Juilliard, a private performing arts school. It was there that he met fellow student Robin Williams, and the two developed a close friendship that would last a lifetime. It was Katharine Hepburn who gave Reeve his big break, casting him as her grandson in a play on Broadway. He stayed with the play throughout its year-long run, and many gossip columnists circulated rumours that the two were romantically attached. After leaving the play, he went on to a few feature film roles, but at the age of just 24, it was his casting as the lead in Superman that really put him on the map in 1978. On his way to his audition, he learnt that Brando and Hackman were involved, so he didn't think he stood a chance. He was 6'4", he was skinny, but he landed the role. And so he entered into an intense 2-month training regime. Though not really a comic book fan, Reeve liked the duality of the role and insisted on showing a new, more sensitive type of masculinity in his portrayal. He would go on to play Superman in 3 further films, but only the first would land him the coveted BAFTA award for most promising newcomer to leading film roles. More importantly for Reeve, he used his newfound celebrity status to support several good causes, from the Make-A-Wish Foundation through to Save the Children.
When you were doing Superman, did you have to say no to a lot of things? Or
Daily.
What kind of things did they ask you to do?
Say to walk into a junior high school dressed in the outfit, go out to in the middle of a football field at halftime with a marching band. The problem, and I explained this to them, we'd have, the marketing guys would sit down, we'd have serious conversations. I said, here's the problem. If I come out at halftime at the Rose Bowl and I come walking out there to the 50-yard line, I have no exit. You see, the next move would be to tip my hand and fly away. I can't do that, okay? So we got a problem. And now eventually I could talk them out of it, but they always were like, well, sure, you just go out there at halftime. I say, yeah, okay, you get the crane, get the wires, And so eventually we went from, but see, they get, it's like an ad agency, whatever, they get creative thinking, they say, what if, and they're entitled to their what if too, and then gradually it all boils down to what's possible.
Throughout the 80s, Reeve would work with Jane Seymour, Vanessa Redgrave and Morgan Freeman. He made a guest appearance on The Muppet Show opposite Miss Piggy, and in a cruel and ironic foreshadowing of what was to come, portrayed a disabled Vietnam veteran on Broadway and a paralysed police officer in Above Suspicion. He also took up horse riding in his spare time. In 1987, Reeve split from his wife. She stayed in London with their children and he remained in New York. Reeve found it hard to find the right scripts that would allow him the time to spend with his kids. But despite this, he starred in one of his better-known films outside of the Superman universe and this week's movie in the spotlight, Village of the Damned. More on that shortly. So I mentioned earlier Reeve had taken up horse riding. It's no surprise to anyone listening that this hobby was what was responsible for the most significant moment of his life. Reeve purchased a 12-year-old American thoroughbred horse, which he nicknamed Buck. While in the midst of a dressage finals in Virginia, the horse pulled up before a 1-meter fence. The force threw Reeve forward, his hands tangled in the horse's reins. Reeve landed head first, shattered 2 bones in his spine. The resulting cervical spinal injury paralyzed him from the neck down for the rest of his life.
What it is, what is broken, what happened here?
Well, I totally decimated my first cervical vertebrae and my second, so my body and my spine and my head were not connected. Only my neck muscles were holding my head on, and fortunately I didn't suffer any brain damage, at least none that I can detect. But, that's what they tell me anyway. But they literally had to put my head back on my body. And a wonderful surgeon, Dr. John Jane, in the University of Virginia was the one who operated on me. And they had to make it up. They'd never done anything like this before.
While recuperating in hospital, his second wife, Dana, said she had to convince Reeve not to give up and slip away. Reeve was determined not to be a burden to her and thought it might be better if he didn't survive. But with her support, Reeve consented to life-saving surgery and treatment for pneumonia and never looked back. While in the ICU, Reeve was in a particularly dark place, worrying about the future and his chances of surviving the surgery, when in burst an eccentric Russian doctor informing Reeve he was going to perform a rectal exam on him. The doctor was his friend Robin Williams. Reeve said it was the first time he had laughed since the accident. Reeve committed himself to a lifetime of self-rehabilitation. Initially despondent about life in a wheelchair, he took it upon himself to use specialised exercise machines to stimulate his muscles, believing that the intense physical therapy might be able to regenerate his nervous system. By the turn of the 21st century, Reeve had indeed begun to move parts of his body again. Doctors were stunned. Following his accident, many people suggest he might find comfort in prayer, but Reeve, who had briefly explored Scientology in the 70s, was not really a man of God. Instead, he claimed that spirituality was in the way we as human beings lived our daily lives. Reeve's legacy is more than Superman and his paralysis, though. His activism work began in the 80s and didn't relent until Reeve passed away in 2004. A champion of causes such as Amnesty International and a staunch environmental advocate are mere tips of the iceberg. He flew to Chile to lead a protest march against the country's dictator, Pinochet. He founded the Creative Coalition, a liberal organisation aiming to teach celebrities how to speak knowledgeably about political issues. In 1996, 10 months after his injury, he appeared at the 68th Academy Awards and urged Hollywood to make more films about social issues. He put spinal cord injury issues on the map, giving speeches all over the world, and was elected chairman of the American Paralysis Association, which later became the Christopher Reeve Foundation. The aim of the organisation was to speed up research through funding and use grants to improve the quality of the lives of people with disabilities. He lobbied for the use of stem cell research, and in the final days of his life, he urged people to vote yes on Proposition 71, which would allow $3 billion to go towards stem cell research. Proposition 71 was approved 1 month after Reeve's death. Reeve's death was a shock. At the age of 52, he slipped into a coma and passed away. His wife and doctor believe his death to be an adverse reaction to an antibiotic he had taken. Reeve had asthma and allergies since he was a child, and these reactions would plague him for life. He was cremated in New York, and his ashes were sprinkled in the wind by his family. So I had no idea about his past experience on stage, and I certainly didn't realise he'd done Superman so early in his career, 24. Perhaps unlike Linda Hamilton in our last episode, I don't think that Superman necessarily defined him. The man did have a career in films and on stage outside of that. But I wonder if he hadn't have had his accident, just what his cinematic legacy could have been. I understand he took to producing a lot of movies after his accident, but I wonder where we would have seen Reeve go with his career. His experience on stage suggests a weight and gravity to the man that I guess I'm just not familiar with. Of course, I've also not really seen anything of his outside of Superman. Learning more about his accident has been sobering too. But it's hugely life-affirming in the lengths and efforts he went to raise awareness and raise funds out of such a terrible thing. And in an absolute tonal shift, let's go and talk about Village of the Damned. I'm sure Christopher would rather we discuss his work rather than his accident anyway.
At precisely 10 a.m., in a quiet seaside village, something happened. Something unexplainable. Something unbelievable.
There's a lot of pregnancies, much more than would normally be expected. All the pregnancies seem to date from the day of the blackout.
Oh no. Now, this town is about to discover that looks can kill.
There have been a few casualties. I should say accidents that might be related to contact with the children.
My daughter was involved. Who are they?
They have one mind that they share between them.
Father?
Let us pray.
You've been discussing us with Dr. Vern. What did she tell you? You're hiding something.
So then, Village of the Damned, released in 1995, directed by John Carpenter and starring Christopher Reeve, Kirstie Alley, yes, of Cheers fame, and Mark Hamill, yes, of Star Wars fame. I'd not seen this film before. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I'm going to talk in the round, so this should be a relatively safe space if you haven't seen the film either. But maybe we should talk about the film first, and then I'll come on to Christopher Reeve's involvement in it a little bit more. It's quite a Twin Peaksy kind of film from John Carpenter. The score has lots of Badalamenti strings. The scenery is quite similar. There's a lot of forests, waters, timber mill. So maybe it's the small town aesthetic of it. There's also very creepy white hair involved in the film. Anyone who's seen Twin Peaks will understand these references. So it was based on a book originally. There was a 1960s version of this film. I haven't seen the original either, so this was all completely new to me. And Mark Hamill plays a priest in this, which is kind of wild. I don't know why it tickles me, but it really does. There's even a John Carpenter cameo early on in the film, which is not something that John Carpenter's really known for doing, I don't think. I don't think John Carpenter's ever done a cameo in a film of his that I've seen before. The core concept of the film is And it's really not spoiling anything to say that this is a small town. Everyone knows everyone. They're all gathering for some sort of party or some sort of festival. And then, before you know it, they are all knocked out. Complete blackout. Everyone in the town is out cold. It's quite a striking image, actually, in the film. They all wake up and all the women are pregnant. And that's your plot. 9 months later, they give birth to children who are very terrifying, very terrible, apparently. This is a very camp film. It's a very silly film. It's a very silly film. It's really not taking itself too seriously. Half the time it is, but half the time it's kind of spoofing things. It's, for example, after the birth of all the children, they are all lined up in the pews of a church waiting to be baptized, and it just looks so ridiculous because every couple has a white-haired baby next to them and they're all smiling. I'm thinking, why are you smiling? You don't know where these babies have come from, honestly. And then, of course, the babies do grow into these young children, and these young children do many terrible things, most of it involving the deaths of people, as you would imagine. They all look like Jimmy Savile with their haircuts, I must say. That is one of the most striking things also. Not just the white hair, the absolute Jimmy Savile aesthetic of the haircuts of these kids is unreal. But ultimately, it's very silly, but it is entertaining. And it is kind of like, you can see how if you watched The Omen and you got on board with Damien's demonic child, that this would be the next fun step, I guess, in that journey. Because it's like, did you like Damien? Here's a bunch of them all working together. There's also some cute versions of the kids. Some of them are not completely evil. There's one called David, who's actually quite cute, and I was rooting for him. I was very much rooting for him, even if he was a bit of a social outlier. And Kirstie Alley is this wild businesswoman, not even businesswoman, she sort of represents scientific governmental interests from outside of the town. And once she hears about everyone having passed out, she comes to town, so immediately you think there's some nefarious intent there. Mark Hamill as the priest, as I said, is quite ridiculous, particularly when you see his shocked face when he's in a birthing class with his wife. Presumably, I'm of the understanding that they have never had sex, so he's kind of stunned as to how he's even found himself in a birthing class with his wife. But it's not. It's by all means not an incredible film. It's not. It's fairly good. It's a fairly good, enjoyable time. I enjoyed it. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend you check it out, particularly as we have our guest of the week, Christopher Reeve, in it. Now, Christopher Reeve is the town doctor. He plays the town doctor. Everyone knows him. Everyone likes him. We're introduced to him with his top off, so they're absolutely cashing in on that Superman aesthetic. And I just can't see past Superman in this film. Every time I'm looking at him, I'm seeing Superman. So I think he does suffer from the curse of having played Superman. But anyway, he does have a certain Clint Eastwood-like aesthetic to him in this. He's faded denim, leather belt, windswept hair, very, very stiff, I would say, particularly in the first half of the film. He's not given too much to work with script-wise, if I'm honest, considering that we learnt that this man trained on stage, theatrical training. I struggle to see it here in this performance. And it's kind of strange because this is exactly the kind of plot and setting that should play into a man who's trained in theatrical dramatic acting to go big with it, because it's a silly premise. There is a point late on in the film where he does go quite big, but it's once he's been pushed to the wall and he confronts the kids. He does have an emotional burst, but there's only like 20 minutes left on the clock of the film by that point.
Life is cruelty. We all feed on each other, exploit each other in some way to survive.
I don't agree with you. I think that adaptation is the key to survival. Cooperation and symbiosis and compassion.
Why do you think your own survival depends upon emotion from us? Should we pity you? Empathize with your plight?
You should feel! You should feel something! Without feelings, you're nothing. You're just second-rate mimics of a higher organism. That's right, a higher organism. We're your superiors in our capacity to love. Without compassion, you're a doomed species.
Emotion is irrelevant. It is not our nature.
Kirstie Alley actually steals the show from him. If I'm being honest, Kirstie Alley is far more compelling to watch. Reeve is kind of the straight man, which is a shame. You know, even once he discovers his wife is pregnant, his wife is kind of wooden too. So that doesn't really spring him to life. That they're just a couple of wooden people that are encountering things in this town. Anyway, he ends up delivering his own baby in this mass maternity ward, which is wild. There are some wild scenes in this. It is worth your time. I did feel that, considering Reeve plays the town doctor, he should have been questioning and interrogating how the hell this mass pregnancy event had happened. He kind of takes it on the chin. There's a few expressions and a few looks of consternation, but largely he's quite placid about it until he's really forced to step up because of the things that the kids in the town are doing. So it's a shame, because we could have got more out of Reeve. I know we could have. I'm not saying he's an incredible actor or performer. Superman, you know, I'm sure 80% of the role is the uniform or the outfit or the cape. What do you call it? I don't know. Whatever you call it, 80% of it is that. One thing that's interesting that becomes a turning point for Reeve's character is his encounters with the child David, the one I mentioned to you, who is sort of an outlier from the other children. They have a bonding moment sort of halfway through the film where you realise, despite their vastly different backgrounds, of course, they actually have a unifying emotion, a unifying experience which connects them on a sort of deeper level. And from that, it propels Reeve to step up and become more in the second half, as it does with the character of David. It's really towards the very end, though, the climax of the film, and as I said, I'm not going to give anything away, where Reeve steps up. He's involved on a very active, proactive level, as opposed to sitting back quite passively letting the events of the film happening to him. He really steps it up, and it's a satisfying ending. The final scene, the final scenario, what it means for his character, it's quite satisfying, and it almost excuses what's come before. So to summarise, the film itself is pretty decent, campy fun from John Carpenter. Considering some of the lesser known stuff from John Carpenter, which when I saw it, I was hugely disappointed by, this probably ranks quite highly. If I were pushed, I would say it's actually better than The Fog. But I was never a massive fan of The Fog anyway. But Reeve is kind of wasted here. We could have had someone else. It didn't need to be him. He didn't really bring anything to it, which is a shame, but that's also part of the experience of this podcast. Now, as with last week, I'm not going to list off countless trivia. You've all got IMDb if you want to really dig deep, but I did find a few interesting tidbits about Village of the Damned. It was apparently shot in Western Marin County, California, which is where John Carpenter had a home. He lived there, so he was very excited to be filming in his hometown, but apparently his neighbours, the locals, made it a terrible experience for him. They were constantly ambushing and harassing and vandalising the set and the people, and they would do silly things like petty things like start up chainsaws while he was trying to film and mowing the lawn. Essentially, Carpenter had to just pay the money to shut up, and they did. So I don't think Carpenter would have filmed there again after that experience. Unfortunately, even though at the time John Carpenter said he was really passionate about making the project, in the last 10 years he said it was just a contractual assignment and he really had no stakes in the game. Christopher Reeve was apparently very kind and friendly to all on set. Everyone speaks highly of him, but he would keep his distance from all the child actors to try and help foster that friction between their characters and his on screen. And I think that kind of works. This is incredible. For those who've seen the film, you will know where this bit would have placed in the film, and I would have loved to have seen it. There is a deleted scene which involves all of the newborn children sitting up and looking to the side at the same time, which 3 fully animatronic babies were constructed for. It was cut from the film, and nobody knows why. The makeup effect artist said he had no clue why it was cut. That's a shame. I would have loved it. That spooky white hair I spoke about, apparently they weren't all wigs. Some of them actually had their hair dyed. David had his hair dyed for it, for example. And if you can believe it, John Carpenter turned down Basic Instinct in order to make this film. So this was the final film released starring Reeve before his accident. And sadly, it's proving really difficult to find any sort of comment from him regarding his experiences making the film or what he thought about it in later years. That's probably not really surprising, given his focus and attention was definitely channeled into other avenues after his accident. The film received negative reviews from critics and failed at the box office upon release. It currently holds a 29% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Very harsh, that is. But Universal Studios obviously thought it was worth taking a punt on, since they had Reeve and Hamill and Ali involved, which would have made it anything but cheap. So before we depart to discuss our Crane connection for this week, let's go to the phones. I see line 2 has lit up. Caller, you are on the air.
Hi Ben, it's Peter here from the Movie Duel podcast, here to give you my thoughts on John Carpenter's Village of the Damned. So, I first saw this film at quite a young age when I was well into my sci-fi, and I remember at the time not really liking it. And having rewatched it quite recently, I very much had the same opinion. I found it very hokey, filled with actors who are in a bit of a slump in their career. Christopher Reeves, Mark Hamill, Kirstie Alley. But Reeves actually puts in quite a decent performance, really. It's quite intense, especially compared to, what we've seen him do as Superman. But I think he plays that conflict quite well. And it's just a shame that maybe not everybody else is taking it as seriously as he is. And don't get me started on the wigs.
A little more full of praise than I was about Reeves' performance there, but seems like Peter didn't enjoy the film overall quite as much as I did. So you'll just have to watch it and decide for yourself, folks.
I just really feel the need to make a connection.
Well, Niles, I think you've made a connection. It just seems a little bit extreme, though,
So let's close out today's episode with our Crane connection, the part of the show where we try to link everything back to the episode of Frasier we watched, specifically where we try to link Reeves' character in The Village of the Damned to his appearance on the show. So let's recap first, shall we? When Reeve called into Frasier's show as Leonard, he was scared to go outside, he was agoraphobic, he would break out in cold sweats just at the thought, and the theme for Frasier's show when he called in was intrusion. So, Village of the Damned. Well, Reeves has been dealing not just with an intrusion, but an invasion. And given everything he endured, I wouldn't be surprised, if he survived the events of the film, not saying what happens, he'd never want to go outside again. In many ways, his character is Leonard, and he's calling up hunkered down in a bunker somewhere, terrified at the thought of leaving safety and having to interact with the world after the events of this film, specifically the children. So, Reeves Leonard and Reeves' character in this film, which I just realised I didn't even tell you his name. Dr. Allen. So, Leonard and Dr. Allen could very well be the same person, and I would say that's a strong Crane connection for this episode. As strong as I can make these connections. Anyway, that brings us to an end. We say goodbye to Frasier and his quest for space. We say goodbye to Leonard and his agoraphobia. Goodbye to Village of the Damned, which for all the negative comments was actually a fun romp of a film, I have to admit. And goodbye to Christopher Reeve, an actor whose legacy as Superman is perhaps only eclipsed by his legacy as an activist away from the screen. Finally, thank you to you new listeners. I genuinely appreciate you joining me as I set off on this mad journey, and I hope you got something from today's episode. You can stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing to Frasier on Film on all the usual podcast platforms. You can connect with me online on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook using @FrasierOnFilm. You can get in touch via email using FrasierOnFilm@gmail.com. Also, in these very early days, let me come begging to you with my handout. If you've liked what you've heard, please do share the podcast. Reviews are very, very important in order for me to find that wider audience. You got me, you found me, so, share the love, put me in front of a few more people. I would appreciate it, and you can do that by leaving me a review on Apple Podcasts so I can master the algorithm. Next week's episode will see us join Frasier, Niles and Martin as they go for the opposite of fine dining in the episode Dinner at 8. Our guest actor for that episode will be Patti LuPone. Patti LuPone, a name which I'm incredibly unfamiliar with, so we're going to learn a little about her together. And that's not going to be the first time on this podcast we'll be doing that. I told you, big names, small names, and everyone in between. And the film which we'll be spotlighting is 2023's Beau is Afraid. Frasier has left the podcast.